Princess Lyravel Saranthi had never been like other royal children of the Volanthi Empire, and she knew this from a very young age, when her interests turned toward the stars, rather than toward politics and power games that consumed her siblings every single day of their lives. Her father had served as an ambassador before becoming emperor, and during those early years he had been stationed on a remote diplomatic outpost that orbited a neutral world far from the throne world, where most royals spent their entire existence wrapped in luxury and scheming against one another for favor and position. It was on this humble station, surrounded by species from across the galaxy, that young Lyravel discovered something her tutors had never taught her about the universe and all the beings who lived within it. She was 12 cycles old when she first saw the human boy, and he was the strangest creature she had ever encountered in her sheltered royal life. Marcus Cole, and he was the son of a maintenance engineer who worked in the lower levels of the station, fixing broken pipes and faulty air recyclers and all the other unglamorous things that kept everyone alive, but earned no respect or recognition from the important people who lived above. Marcus was thin and awkward, with messy dark hair that never seemed to stay flat, no matter how many times he pushed it down with his small hands, and he had eyes the color of a nebula she had once seen in her astronomy lessons, deep and brown and filled with light that seemed impossible for such a low-born creature from such a young species. The Volanthi considered humans to be barely worth noticing, a species that had only recently crawled out of their single planet and started exploring the stars like curious children wandering into a forest filled with ancient and dangerous things they could not possibly understand. But Marcus did not act like someone who knew he was supposed to. Be insignificant in the grand order of the galaxy. On the day they met, Lyravel had been sitting alone in the observation deck, hiding from her tutors and their endless lessons about proper royal behavior, when the human boy walked in and sat down right next to her, without any hesitation or fear. "You have spots on your face," he said, pointing at the ceremonial markings that covered her cheeks and forehead, the sacred patterns that marked her as royalty among her people. "They are not spots," she replied, with all the dignity a 12-cycle-old princess could summon. "They are the sacred markings of the Saranthi bloodline, and they have been carried by my family for 10,000 years. Marcus tilted his head and looked at her with genuine curiosity, rather than the fear or reverence she usually received from others. And then he smiled a crooked smile that showed a gap where he had recently lost a tooth. "They look like the stars," he said, "like someone painted a constellation on your skin." No one had ever described her markings that way before, and Lyravel found herself unable to form a proper response to this strange human child, who spoke to her as if she were just another person, rather than the daughter of the most powerful being in 12 star systems. That was the beginning of their friendship, and over the next 3 years, they became inseparable, despite everything that should have kept them apart. Marcus taught her human games with strange names like hide-and-seek and tag that involved running and laughing and acting in ways that would have horrified her etiquette instructors if they had ever witnessed such undignified behavior from a princess of the blood. She taught him to read Volanthi star charts and told him the ancient stories of her people, the legends of heroes and monsters and great wars fought among the stars, long before humans had learned to make fire on their distant little world. He listened to every story with wide eyes full of wonder, and then he told her his own stories, wild, impossible tales about human heroes who fought against terrible odds and never gave up, no matter how hopeless things seemed. "Humans are stubborn," he explained to her one day as they sat together watching ships come and go through the station's massive windows. "My dad says we are too stupid to know when we should quit, and that is why we keep going when smarter species would give up. Lyravel laughed at this, but she also stored the words away in her memory, because there was something in the way Marcus said them that made her think they might be more important than they sounded. One day a Krathani boy who was twice Marcus's size began mocking Lyravel's sacred markings, calling them ugly, and saying that the Volanthi were a dying empire that would soon be forgotten by the galaxy. Before Lyravel could respond with the cold dignity her tutors had taught her, Marcus had already thrown himself at the much larger alien and punched him directly in what passed for a Krathani nose. The fight was short, and Marcus lost badly, ending up with a black eye and a split lip and bruises covering most of his small body. But the Krathani boy never bothered Lyravel again, because he had learned something that day about humans that he would not soon forget. "Why did you do that?" Lyravel demanded, as she helped Marcus clean the blood from his face. "He was twice your size, and you knew you could not win." Marcus grinned despite his swollen lip, and shrugged his thin shoulders as if fighting impossible battles was simply what one did when someone insulted their friend. "He was being mean to you," Marcus said, "and you are my friend, so I had to do something, even if I could not win." The day came when Lyravel's father summoned her back to the throne world, and she knew that her time on the station had come to an end. Forever. She found Marcus in their favorite spot on the observation deck, and he was holding something behind his back with a nervous expression on his bruised face. "I made you something," he said, and he held out a bracelet made from salvaged wire and a single polished metal bead that caught the light of distant stars. "I know it is not fancy like the stuff princesses are supposed to have, but I wanted you to have something to remember me by." Lyravel took the crude bracelet and felt tears forming in her eyes, which was absolutely unacceptable behavior for a royal of her standing. But she found that she did not care about proper behavior in that moment. "When we are older," Marcus said, with all the confidence of a child who did not yet understand how large and cruel the universe could be, "I will find you again, I promise." She laughed through her tears because he was human, a member of a species with short lifespans and no real power in the galaxy. What could he possibly become that would allow him to keep such an impossible promise to a princess who would one day rule an empire? But she kept the bracelet, wearing it hidden beneath her royal robes where no one would see it, and asked questions she did not want to answer. 20 cycles passed like water flowing through her fingers, and Lyravel grew from a child into a woman who stood at her aging father's side as the galaxy burned around them. The Dominion War had raged for 6 terrible years, and a coalition of 12 species fought desperately against the hierarchy, a machine-synthetic collective that consumed star system after star system with cold mechanical efficiency that left nothing but death and silence in its wake. Her people were losing, and Princess Lyravel stood on the command deck of her father's flagship, watching the war reports with growing despair in her heart. She had almost forgotten the scrawny human boy with the gap-toothed smile, almost forgotten the crude wire bracelet that still hung hidden against her skin after all these years. Almost, but not quite, because some promises are too precious to forget completely, even when the universe seems determined to burn everything good and hopeful to ash. The War Summit convened on Throne World Volanthi, in the Great Hall where emperors had made decisions that shaped the galaxy for thousands upon thousands of years, and Princess Lyravel attended as her aging father's representative, because the emperor was too weak to stand for long periods anymore. 12 species sat around the massive hollow table, their holographic displays showing nothing but retreat lines and casualty figures and the slow, terrible advance of the hierarchy across territory that had taken centuries to claim and build and fill with life. The Volanthi Grand Admiral was an old warrior named Thexus, who had fought in 3 previous wars and had never known defeat until now. And his voice carried the heavy weight of exhaustion and despair as he addressed the assembled representatives. "We have lost the outer reaches entirely," he announced, his ceremonial markings seeming to fade with every word he spoke. The hierarchy's advance continues without pause and without mercy, and we estimate 4 cycles before they reach the core territories where our civilian populations are concentrated. The representatives began to argue among themselves, each species blaming the others for failures and mistakes and poor decisions that had led them all to this moment of desperation. The Krathani ambassador demanded more ships from the Volanthi fleet, while the Volanthi admirals insisted that they had already given more than their fair share of blood and treasure to this losing war. Voices rose and accusations flew across the table like weapons, and Lyravel watched it all with a cold feeling growing in her stomach, because she understood that this was what defeat looked like before it became official. Then the human ambassador rose to speak, and the chamber fell into a contemptuous silence, because everyone knew that the humans had contributed almost nothing to the war effort so far. Director Chen was a stern woman with gray hair pulled back tight against her skull, and eyes that seemed to see through every lie and pretense in the room, and she stood perfectly still until she had the attention of everyone present. "We are committing the 1st Terran Expeditionary Force to the front lines," she announced in a voice that carried no doubt or hesitation. "Effective immediately." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the chamber, and several Volanthi admirals exchanged looks of open amusement at the idea that humans could make any difference in this war. The human military was barely a century old. Everyone knew this, and their ships were crude, and their soldiers were unaugmented, and their tactics were considered primitive by the standards of species who had been waging interstellar warfare for millennia. Admiral Thexus leaned forward with what might have been pity on his scarred face as he addressed the human ambassador directly. "We appreciate the gesture." That suggested he did not appreciate it at all. "But what could your forces possibly contribute that our own warriors cannot provide in greater numbers and with superior technology?" Director Chen smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Lyravel suddenly pay very close attention to what was happening. "We are sending the Hellwalkers," Director Chen said, "and their commander." She activated a holographic display that appeared in the center of the table, and suddenly the chamber was filled with battle footage from a world called Vexar Ridge that had been written off as lost 3 cycles ago when the hierarchy had overwhelmed its defenders. The footage showed a human soldier in scarred black armor moving through waves of hierarchy drones with a speed and brutality that seemed impossible for an unaugmented organic being. He did not fight like Volanthi warriors fought, with elegant precision and careful economy of movement that minimized risk, while maximizing efficiency. This human fought like a wild animal that had decided the universe itself would break before he did, throwing himself into impossible situations with weapons blazing and emerging somehow still alive, while machines fell broken around him. The footage shifted to show him carrying a wounded Krathani soldier across 2 kilometers of open ground, while hierarchy forces fired at him constantly, and he did not stop or slow down, even when projectiles struck his armor and drew blood from wounds that should have dropped him. Another clip showed him holding a defensive line for 19 hours after his entire squad had been killed around him, fighting without sleep or rest or any apparent concern for his own survival. The final clip showed him walking alone into a hierarchy command node, a massive structure bristling with weapons and filled with combat drones, and then walking out carrying the enemy's core processor while the entire building collapsed behind him in flames. "Vexar Ridge was retaken," Director Chen said into the stunned silence that had fallen over the chamber. 2,000 human soldiers landed on that world, and 43 walked away when it was over. But they won. Admiral Thexus stared at the frozen image of the human soldier, with something that might have been fear or might have been awe growing in his ancient eyes. "They call him the demon," Director Chen continued, "and the hierarchy has started routing forces away from any sector where he is reported to be operating." The Krathani ambassador leaned forward with sudden intense interest, because his people respected strength above all things, and what he had just witnessed was strength beyond anything he had expected from the young human species. "What is his name?" Admiral Thexus asked, "this demon of yours?" Director Chen turned off the holographic display and looked around the chamber at representatives who had dismissed her species as insignificant just moments ago. "Brigadier General Marcus Cole," she said. Princess Liravel felt the world spin around her as those two words struck her like physical blows, and she grabbed the edge of the table to keep herself from falling as her heart pounded in her chest. Marcus Cole. The scrawny boy who had given her a wire bracelet and promised to find her someday was the legendary monster that the hierarchy feared. Her hand moved without conscious thought to her wrist, where that same bracelet still hung hidden beneath her ceremonial robes after 20 cycles of war and loss and loneliness. She barely heard the rest of the meeting as representatives discussed logistics and deployment schedules and all the practical matters that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the revelation that had just shattered everything she thought she knew. How had the gap-toothed child who told her stories about human stubbornness become the demon that made machines flee in terror? What had happened to him in those 20 years to transform him from a maintenance engineer's son into a legend that admirals spoke of with hushed voices? The meeting ended, and Liravel walked through the corridors of her father's palace in a daze, her mind spinning with questions she could not answer, and memories she had tried so hard to bury. She remembered his smile, and his ridiculous stories, and the way he had thrown himself at that Krathani bully without any hesitation or concern for his own safety. She remembered his words about human stubbornness, about being too stupid to quit when smarter species would give up. And she realized that the demon of Vexar Ridge was not a monster created by war and violence, but a man who had taken that stubborn refusal to surrender and forged it into something that could shake the foundations of an empire. The Terran delegation would arrive in 3 days. Marcus Cole would walk into her father's palace as a hero and a legend. She would see him again after 20 years, and she had absolutely no idea what she would say to the boy who had kept his impossible promise in the most impossible way she could have imagined. The wire bracelet felt warm against her skin, and Liravel wondered if he had forgotten her the way she had almost forgotten him. She wondered if there was anything left of the boy she had known inside the demon the galaxy now feared. And she wondered what it had cost him to become something strong enough to keep a childhood promise made in innocence and hope. The Terran delegation arrived 3 days later aboard a warship that bore the scars of 100 battles, and Princess Liravel positioned herself carefully among the gathered dignitaries who had come to witness the arrival of humanity's legendary warriors. She told herself that her interest was purely strategic, and that any leader would want to observe potential allies closely. But her heart knew the truth, even if her mind refused to admit it. The human soldiers who marched into the palace were nothing like the weak and primitive creatures that Volanthi propaganda had always portrayed. And Liravel felt the gathered crowd shift uneasily as the Hellwalkers moved through the entrance hall. They were lean and hard, with scars covering their exposed skin, and eyes that had witnessed horrors beyond anything the pampered nobles around her could imagine. And they moved in perfect synchronization, like a single organism with many bodies. Yet each one of them radiated an aura of individual lethality that made even the Volanthi Royal Guard take unconscious steps backward as they passed. And Liravel understood suddenly why the hierarchy had learned to fear these strange, short-lived creatures from a single, unremarkable world. And at the head of this terrifying column walked Marcus Cole. He was tall now, because humans grew so quickly during their brief lives, and gray had begun to streak through his dark hair, though he could not be more than 40 standard years old by human reckoning. A web of scars crossed his jaw and neck like a map of every battle he had survived, and his left arm was gone entirely, replaced by a brutal military-grade cybernetic limb that looked more like a weapon than a replacement body part. But his eyes were the same. That impossible stubborn fire she remembered from a boy who had punched a bully twice his size still burned in those nebula-brown depths, and Lyra felt her breath catch in her throat as 20 years of memories crashed over her like a wave. The formal reception was agony for her as she stood among the other dignitaries and watched Marcus greet her father with perfect military courtesy that gave no hint of the connection they had once shared. She watched admirals who had mocked humanity just days ago now hanging on his every word, as he outlined a counter-offensive strategy using holographic displays and tactical projections that made the Volante's own battle plans look like the scribblings of children. His voice was deeper now, and carried the weight of command that came from years of sending soldiers to their deaths and living with the consequences. And Lyra searched desperately for any trace of the boy who had told her wild stories about human heroes. The crowd shifted around them as the reception continued, and finally their eyes met across the crowded hall. She saw recognition flash across his scarred face like lightning, illuminating a dark sky, and she watched him freeze for one heartbeat as 20 years of war and loss and determination flickered behind his gaze. For that single moment, she saw Marcus the boy looking out from behind the eyes of the demon, and her heart ached with a grief she had not known she was carrying. Then the moment passed, and he bowed formally, with perfect military precision, as if she were just another royal dignitary, rather than the girl who still wore his crude wire bracelet against her skin. "Your Highness," he said in a voice that betrayed nothing. "General Cole," she replied in a voice she barely recognized as her own. The reception continued around them, and Lyra performed her duties as a princess with mechanical precision, while her mind raced with questions she could not ask in front of so many watching eyes. That night, she found him alone on the observation deck of the palace's highest tower, standing in the same position he had always favored when they were children together on that distant station, staring out at the stars with an expression she could not read. The wire bracelet felt heavy on her wrist as she approached, and she wondered if he could hear her heart's pounding in the silence of the empty deck. "You remembered," she said, and her voice came out softer than she had intended. "I never forgot," he replied without turning to face her. "I told you I would find you." "You were supposed to find me, Marcus," she said, and she heard her voice crack as the emotions she had buried for 20 years finally broke through her royal composure. "Not become this." She gestured at the scars that covered every visible inch of his skin, and the cybernetic arm that hummed softly with deadly potential, and the weight of legend and fear that pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He finally turned to face her, and she saw the boy she had known, buried deep beneath layers of pain and loss and the terrible things he had done to survive. "The hierarchy burned my homeworld, Lyra," he said, in a voice that was quiet but carried the gravity of collapsed stars. "They killed my family and my friends and everyone I had ever known, except for the memory of a princess who taught me to read star charts." His cybernetic hand clenched into a fist that could crush metal, and she saw the ghost of that gap-toothed smile flicker across his scarred face. "I did not choose to become this," he continued. "I became this because someone had to, and I was too stubborn to die when smarter people would have given up." Lyra felt tears forming in her eyes, and she did not care that crying was unacceptable behavior for a princess of her standing, because the boy she had known had suffered more than anyone should ever have to suffer. 20 years, Marcus," she whispered. 20 years of war, and you never stopped." "I could not stop," he said, and for the first time, she heard something vulnerable beneath his soldier's composure. "Because if I stopped, then all the people who died believing in me would have died for nothing." He reached into a pocket of his uniform and pulled out something small and worn that glinted in the starlight, and Lyra Vell gasped when she recognized what it was. A metal bead on a simple cord, the twin of the one she wore hidden against her wrist, crude and worthless, and more precious than all the treasures of her empire. "I made 2 of them," Marcus said with a ghost of his old smile. "I kept one to remind myself that somewhere out there a princess was waiting, even if she did not know she was waiting." He looked at her, and she saw the demon fall away entirely, leaving only Marcus, the boy who had promised to find her across all the distances of space and time. "I never forgot you, Lyra," he said. "You were the only good thing I had left to believe in, when everything else burned." She stepped forward and took his hand in hers, the flesh one rather than the metal one, and she felt the warmth of his skin, and the calluses from years of holding weapons, and the slight tremor of exhaustion that he hid from everyone else. "I kept your bracelet," she said, and she pulled back her sleeve to reveal the wire circle that had hung against her skin for 20 cycles. "I never took it off, even when I thought I had forgotten why it mattered." Marcus stared at the crude jewelry he had made as a child, and something broke behind his eyes, something hard and cold that had protected him through years of impossible battles and terrible losses. "We are not the same people we were," Lyra Vell said softly, "but maybe that is acceptable, because the universe is not the same either." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, and for the first time since his arrival, he looked like a man rather than a legend. "But I kept my promise, Lyra. I found you," said with a smile that felt strange after so many years of royal composure. "You did." The counter-offensive began 3 weeks after the Terran delegation's arrival, and Princess Lyra Vell secured a position as coalition liaison to the human forces over her father's strenuous objections. The Emperor had begged her to remain safe on the throne world, where royal blood belonged, but she had refused with a stubbornness that surprised even herself, and that Marcus would have recognized from their childhood together. She needed to understand what humans truly were beneath their legends and their terrifying reputation, and she needed to see with her own eyes what it had cost Marcus to become the demon the galaxy feared. What she witnessed over the following months rewrote everything she thought she knew about humanity and about the limits of what living beings could endure. Marcus's strategy was considered insane by Valanthy military standards, because it relied on aggression and adaptability and psychological warfare, rather than the careful, calculated approaches that her people had refined over millennia of interstellar conflict. Where Valanthy commanders fought to minimize casualties and preserve forces for future engagements, Marcus fought to maximize terror in the enemy and break their will to continue fighting. "Machines do not feel fear the way organic beings do," he explained to her one night as they reviewed tactical displays aboard his command ship. "But the hierarchy is not purely machine. There are organic components in their network that process information and make decisions, and those components can learn to dread." She watched human medics perform surgery on themselves in the field so they could return to combat, rather than burden their units with wounded soldiers who needed evacuation. And she felt sick with horror and admiration at the same time. She watched human soldiers vote unanimously to hold a position that everyone knew was doomed, so that a civilian transport could escape with refugees. And then she watched those same soldiers win against impossible odds through sheer refusal to accept the death they had been willing to embrace. She watched Marcus stand alone in the path of a hierarchy assault walker, a massive killing machine that towered over him like a god of destruction, armed with nothing but explosives strapped to his body and a look of absolute determination on his scarred face. The walker should have killed him instantly, but somehow he dodged its weapons and climbed its legs and planted his charges in its joints and rode it down as it collapsed, emerging from the wreckage covered in blood and machine fluid with that terrible smile on his face. "How do you keep surviving?" she demanded as medics patched the wounds he had accumulated in that single engagement. How do you do things that should be impossible and walk away? Marcus laughed, and there was something dark and broken in that laughter that made her hearts ache. Humans are too stupid to know when we should die, he said, echoing words he had spoken to her 20 years ago on a distant station. We just keep going until the universe gets tired of trying to kill us. But she also saw the cost of his impossible survival, and it was higher than she had ever imagined. She heard him wake screaming from nightmares that he pretended not to have, shouting names she did not recognize, in a voice raw with grief and guilt. She watched him memorize the name and family history of every single soldier who died under his command, spending hours studying personnel files so that he could write personal letters to their loved ones that acknowledged them as individuals rather than statistics. She saw him break a display screen with his cybernetic fist after a battle that had cost 300 human lives. A victory by every tactical measure, but a tragedy in his eyes, because each of those 300 had been someone's child, or parent, or friend. How do you bear it? She asked him one night, as they sat together in a bombed-out command post, waiting for reinforcements that might never come, listening to the distant sounds of hierarchy drones, searching for survivors. Marcus stared at his hands, the flesh one scarred and calloused, and the metal one dented and scratched from years of combat, and he did not answer for a long time. I do not bear it, he finally said in a voice so quiet she had to strain to hear. Every death is a weight that I carry forever, and the weight gets heavier with every battle. He looked at her with eyes that held oceans of grief behind their stubborn fire, and she saw for the first time how close he always was to breaking beneath the burden he carried. That is what makes us human, Lyra, he said. We break, we shatter, we lose pieces of ourselves that never come back, no matter how much we want them to. His cybernetic hand clenched and unclenched, in a rhythmic pattern she had come to recognize as his way of managing emotions he could not allow himself to show in front of his soldiers. But we keep going anyway, he continued, because the alternative is letting the darkness win, and I have seen too much darkness to let it have one more inch of this galaxy without a fight. Lyra Vell reached out and took his metal hand in both of hers, feeling the cold alloy warm slightly under her touch. And she understood something about humans that her people had never grasped. Volanthi warriors were taught to control their emotions and fight with cold precision, because feeling too deeply was considered a weakness that would compromise their effectiveness in battle. But humans drew their strength from feeling everything, from loving so deeply that loss became unbearable, and fighting so hard because every death mattered to them as individuals, rather than as numbers on a casualty report. Other species in any physical sense, but they were stronger in ways that mattered more, in their refusal to become numb and their insistence on caring, even when caring hurt more than they could stand. The tide of the war began to turn as the months passed and the Hellwalkers pushed deeper into hierarchy territory, with coalition forces supporting their advance. System by system the enemy was pushed back, and with each victory, the legend of the Terran warriors grew, until even the most arrogant Volanthi admirals spoke of humans with respect that bordered on awe. Lyra Vell fought alongside them and learned their ways and earned their trust through blood and sacrifice. And somewhere along the way, she stopped being a princess playing at war and became a warrior in her own right. She learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. And she learned that small, insignificant species could burn brighter than ancient empires, if only they refused to accept that their smallness made them unimportant. And through it all, she watched Marcus carry his impossible burden with a grace that broke her hearts, watched him smile for his soldiers and weep alone in the darkness, and keep fighting, because giving up had never been something he knew how to do. I understand now, she told him one night as they stood together watching coalition ships jump to hyperspace for the next phase of the offensive. I understand why you became the demon. Marcus looked at her with surprise flickering across his scarred features. You did not become a monster to survive, she said. You became a monster so that others could survive, so that someone would stand between the darkness and everyone it wanted to devour. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he smiled the same crooked smile she remembered from a boy, with a gap-toothed grin, who had given her a wire bracelet. Maybe, he said, or maybe I was just too stubborn to let the machines have the last word. She laughed, and it felt strange and wonderful to laugh in the middle of a war that had cost so many lives. But Marcus had always had a gift for making impossible things feel possible. Either way, she said, I am glad you found me. So am I, he replied, and in his voice she heard the boy he had been, and the man he had become, and the hero the galaxy needed him to be. The final battle for the Hierarchy Core took place in a region of space called the Void of Shadows, a place so hostile that navigation had been considered impossible by every species that had ever attempted to map its treacherous currents of radiation and gravitational anomalies. But humans had never been good at accepting that things were impossible, and Marcus Cole had spent 6 months studying the void until he found a path that only someone with nothing left to lose would dare to attempt. Princess Lyra Vell stood on the bridge of her command ship as the Coalition fleet prepared for the assault, and her father's voice echoed in her memory from their final conversation before his death 3 months earlier. You have become something I never expected, the old emperor had whispered from his deathbed. Something better than I ever was, and I am proud of you. She was empress now, though the coronation would have to wait until the war was won or lost in the darkness ahead, and she had learned more about leadership from watching Marcus Cole than from all her years of royal education. The fleet jumped into the void, and immediately chaos erupted, as hierarchy forces appeared from every direction, more ships and drones than anyone had predicted, because the machines had been massing their strength for a final desperate defense. All units engage, Lyra Vell commanded, and her voice carried across the fleet with a confidence she had learned from humans, who believed that tone could be more important than tactics. The battle was brutal beyond anything she had witnessed in months of fighting alongside the Hellwalkers, and ships on both sides burned and died as the two forces clashed in the swirling darkness. Marcus and his soldiers breached the Hierarchy Core itself, while the fleet held the line outside, fighting their way through corridors filled with combat drones and automated defenses that should have been impenetrable. 17 hours of silence followed as the fleet fought to survive, and Lyra Vell paced the bridge of her command ship with one hand pressed against the wire bracelet that still hung hidden beneath her armor. She had kissed him before he left, a desperate, urgent kiss that said everything words could not express. And he had smiled that crooked smile and promised to come back because he had never broken a promise to her yet. Network collapsing across all sectors, returning home. Cheers erupted across the fleet as the hierarchy ships began to falter and drift without the central intelligence that had coordinated their attacks, and Lyra Vell felt tears streaming down her face as relief overwhelmed her. When the surviving Hellwalker shuttle finally docked with her flagship, she was waiting in the hangar bay with medics and officers and everyone who wanted to witness the return of the heroes who had ended the war. Only 19 soldiers walked out of that shuttle, 19 survivors of the hundreds who had breached the core, and Marcus was carried on a stretcher between them. His remaining organic arm was gone now, torn away by something terrible in the depths of the enemy fortress, and blood seeped from wounds that should have killed any rational being long before he reached medical care. But he was smiling, that impossible crooked smile, as the medics rushed to stabilize him, and His eyes found hers across the crowded hangar. "Told you I would come back," he whispered, before the sedatives pulled him under. The war ended 3 cycles later, as the hierarchy fragmented and collapsed without its central intelligence to coordinate its forces, and the galaxy began the long, slow process of rebuilding everything that had been lost. On the day of the victory celebration, Empress Lyravel addressed the coalition from the steps of her palace, with representatives of 12 species gathered to witness the dawn of a new era. She spoke of sacrifice and unity, and the debt that all of them owed to those who had given everything, so that others might live. And her voice carried across the galaxy through broadcasts that reached every surviving world. And then she called Marcus Cole forward to receive the highest honor her people could bestow. He walked slowly because his new cybernetic legs were still unfamiliar, and both his arms were metal now, gleaming in the light of the celebration. But his eyes still held that stubborn fire that had never dimmed through all the years of war and pain. The star of endless dawn has never been given to anyone outside the Volanthi bloodline, Lyravel announced as she held the ancient medal that shimmered with captured starlight. But the one who receives it today has earned it more than any who came before. She placed the medal around his neck, and the crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. And Marcus stood before them all, looking uncomfortable with the attention, in a way that made her smile. "I was just too stubborn to quit," he muttered so only she could hear. "I know," she replied. "That is why you deserved it." Later that night, in a private ceremony, witnessed only by the surviving Hellwalkers, Lyravel removed the wire bracelet from her wrist and pressed it into Marcus's metal palm. "Promise," she said. "You found me across 20 years and a war that almost destroyed everything." Marcus looked at the crude jewelry that had somehow survived as long as he had, and his scarred face softened with emotions he rarely allowed himself to show. "I made another promise once," he said. "Something about stars and stories, about showing you all the places I dreamed of when we were children." Lyravel raised an eyebrow in the human fashion she had learned over months of fighting alongside his soldiers. "We are not children anymore, Marcus," she said. "I am an empress with a galaxy to rebuild, and you are a legend that people will tell stories about for centuries." "No," he agreed, and he closed his metal fingers gently around the bracelet. "But I have a lot of stories to tell, and you have a lot of rebuilding to do." His eyes sparkled with something ancient and new all at once, the same light she remembered from a boy who had looked at the stars and dared to dream of impossible things. "Seems like we have time," he said, "if you want it." She stepped forward and took his face in her hands, feeling the scars beneath her fingers, and the warmth of his skin, and the steady pulse of life that had refused to stop no matter how hard the universe tried. "I have been waiting 20 years for you to ask," she said, "and I am not letting you disappear into legend without me." Years later, historians would write about the Dominion War as the moment humanity announced itself to the galaxy, not with diplomacy or trade, but with fire and sacrifice and an unyielding refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible. They would write about the Hellwalkers and the demon who led them, and the alien empress who fought beside them, and learned what it truly meant to be brave. But in the private gardens of the Imperial Palace, where an old soldier and an empress walked together in the evenings, watching the stars come out one by one, there was only the memory of 2 children who had looked at the universe and dared to dream, and a promise kept across 20 years and 1,000 light years of war, proving that some bonds are stronger than distance and time, and all the darkness that tries to tear them apart. Marcus smiled as Lyravel leaned against his shoulder, and the wire bracelet glinted on his metal wrist, where he wore it always. "I found you," he said softly, Yes, she replied, you did. And that was enough. For both of them. Forever.